What do you want?
Hello, it's me, your brother.
You can't tell.
Can you be in Los Angeles, California in 24 hours?
Goodbye.
All those things.
Was your brother?
King was meeting with. Let me do the talking. Nice.
I don't torture people. How do you know that?
This is it.
Go over the plan again.
Plan? Yeah.
The Accountant 2, 2025 Complete Film Analysis and Explanations. This is a comprehensive analysis and explanation of the film The Accountant 2, 2025. The following paragraphs delve deep into the narrative, character arcs, themes, and production context of this sequel, exploring how it expands upon the original while charting its own divisive course. We begin by establishing the foundation of the film's creation and the initial spark that sets the plot in motion. The Accountant 2 arrives nearly a decade after the original, a gap that is cleverly mirrored in the story itself, where the Wolf brothers have not spoken in 8 years. This passage of time is not just a marketing reality, but a narrative tool, allowing the characters to have evolved off-screen in ways that create immediate friction and curiosity upon their reunion. Director Gavin O'Connor and screenwriter Bill Dubuque return for this installment, ensuring a continuity of vision, even as the tone notably shifts. Their decision to lean away from the first film's methodical, almost melancholic study of isolation and toward a broader, more self-aware buddy comedy dynamic is the single most defining creative choice of the sequel, setting the stage for everything that follows. The analysis begins with the inciting incident, a classic noir setup, a mysterious meeting in a dimly lit tavern. J.K. Simmons' Raymond King, now a private investigator, meets a woman named Anais, played by Daniela Pineda, for reasons that are initially opaque. This scene immediately establishes a tone of creeping dread, where a simple conversation is suffused with the threat of violence. The interruption of their meeting by a hitman is a brutally efficient piece of action storytelling. It signals that whatever King has stumbled into is extraordinarily dangerous and that the normal rules of engagement are off. King's death is swift, but his final act is one of supreme purpose, setting the entire plot into motion with a single, desperate message. King's decision to write "Find the Accountant" on his own forearm in his dying moments is a profound act of faith and desperation. It is a direct communication from beyond the grave to his protégé, Mary Beth Medina, and an implicit acknowledgement that the threat he uncovered is beyond the capacity of conventional law enforcement to handle, requiring a uniquely configured mind. This message serves as a narrative baton pass. The original film was about the Treasury Department hunting Christian Wolff. The sequel begins with the Treasury Department needing him. This inversion immediately puts Christian in a more powerful, if more dangerous, position, as his unique skills are now a commodity that the government must solicit rather than prosecute. Mary Beth Medina, now the director of FinCEN, is the audience's initial point of re-entry into this world. Her discovery of King's message transforms her from a character who once hunted Christian into one who must now become his reluctant partner, creating a dynamic built on uneasy history and diametrically opposed worldviews. When we are reintroduced to Ben Affleck's Christian Wolff, he is in a deeply unexpected environment, a speed dating event. This sequence is a masterclass in comedic characterization, showing that Christian has taken the first film's thematic journey of seeking connection to heart. He has not simply remained a static, isolated figure. He has been actively, disastrously, trying to engage with the world. The revelation that Christian has rigged the speed dating event using hacked algorithms to find his optimal match is a perfect encapsulation of his character. It demonstrates his genius, his profound misunderstanding of human emotion, and his deep-seated yearning, all within a single darkly funny moment. He approaches finding love with the same methodical logic as a forensic audit, and it fails for exactly that reason. His social awkwardness remains intact, but it is presented with a new layer of self-awareness. He is no longer just bewildered by social cues. He occasionally displays a wry, knowing humor about his own failings. This evolution is crucial, as it prevents his character from becoming a static collection of tics and transforms him into someone who is actively, if haltingly, growing. The analysis of Christian's character must center on this central contradiction. A man whose mind is a fortress of logic who desperately craves the illogical, messy chaos of human love. Affleck's performance internalizes this, showing a man for whom a subtle smile or a self-deprecating joke represents a monumental leap of emotional vulnerability, a crack in the stoic armor he has built. This personal journey of reaching out extends to his decision to recruit his brother, Braxton. Christian seeking out Braxton is the emotional core of the film. He is not just recruiting a lethal asset. He is trying to rebuild a family bridge that has been dormant for 8 years, turning a professional mission into a deeply personal one. Jon Bernthal's Braxton is the film's chaotic, charismatic engine. Promoted from a late film revelation in the original to a full co-lead, Braxton operates on pure ID, a volatile counterpoint to Christian's hyper-controlled superego. Where Christian calculates every variable, Braxton solves problems with brute force and a feral grin. Their dynamic is instantly reestablished not through heartfelt conversation, but through action and conflict. One of the most illustrative scenes is Christian deliberately instigating a bar fight, not for any tactical reason, but simply to give Braxton an environment to do what he loves. This is their love language, a transaction of controlled chaos that speaks louder than any direct expression of affection. The chemistry between Affleck and Bernthal is the foundational pillar upon which the entire film rests. Critical consensus, regardless of overall opinion on the film, is virtually unanimous on this point. Their bickering, their shared history, and their opposing personalities create a lovingly combative energy that provides both the film's biggest laughs and its only genuine emotional stakes. The investigation they launch into King's murder unravels a conspiracy that is more sprawling and internationally focused than the corporate malfeasance of the first film. It leads them toward the disappearance of a Salvadoran family, a narrative thread that pulls the action away from high-finance boardrooms and into the brutal, physical world of human trafficking. This shift in criminal enterprise is deliberate. While the first film's villainy was often found in ledgers and cooked books, the sequel's antagonists are physically brutal smugglers. This allows the action to become more visceral and the moral stakes to become more primal, centering on the physical rescue of the vulnerable rather than the financial exposure of the corrupt. The character of Anais, the woman from the opening tavern scene, is the film's most audacious and problematic creation. Her backstory, as it unfolds, reveals her to be a former Salvadoran migrant who suffered a catastrophic car crash while escaping an assault. This trauma is the key to her transformation. The film introduces the concept of acquired savant syndrome through Anais. The head trauma she endured did not just injure her. It completely rewired her brain, turning a mild-mannered wife and mother into a hyper-competent, deadly assassin with extraordinary combat abilities. It is a comic book origin story dressed in the language of neuroscience. This concept is a double-edged sword for the film's thematic analysis. On one hand, it provides a formidable, tragic, and physically unique female antagonist whose skills rival Christian's. On the other, it deepens the franchise's controversial conflation of brain injury and neurodivergence with superhuman abilities, a theme that reaches its apotheosis later in the film. Anaïs's tragedy is that she retains fragments of her former life, remembering her family through scattered flashbacks. This makes her a sympathetic figure, a mother who is violently unmade and remade into a weapon. She is not purely evil. She is a broken person operating within a brutal system, her quest for her family twisted into a homicidal mission. The narrative pathway eventually leads the brothers back to Harbor Neuroscience, the treatment center from Christian's childhood. This is not a simple location revisit. It represents a return to the origin of Christian's own story, linking the current crisis directly to the foundational trauma of his past and the institutional setting that shaped him. Inside Harbor Neuroscience, the analysis must confront the film's most overt foray into what critics have called mutant X-Men territory. The facility is now home to a group of autistic child savants, but they are not simply gifted. They possess hacking and intelligence-gathering capabilities that the film explicitly states exceed those of the National Security Agency. This is the crux of the film's controversial representation of neurodivergence. The first film hinted at the idea of autism as a form of different wiring that grants unique gifts. The sequel abandons any pretense of realism, imagining the human mind as possessing boundless comic book-esque talents just waiting to be unlocked through the right form of trauma or training. This narrative choice is both a fantastical empowerment and a damaging stereotype. It suggests that for a neurodivergent person to be accepted or valuable in a mainstream action narrative, their condition must come with a compensatory superpower. The children are less characters and more a convenient, all-powerful deus ex machina that the script can activate whenever the plot requires an impossible problem to be instantly solved. A key supporting figure in this world is Justine, Christian's nonverbal handler, who communicates through a British-accented computer voice. Her role is expanded significantly. She is no longer just Christian's logistical support. She is the den mother and director of this group of savant children, a powerful off-screen presence who can weaponize information with a few keystrokes. The relationship between Justine and Christian provides a quiet, stable form of human connection that contrasts with his chaotic quest for romance. It is a platonic, functional bond built on mutual respect and long-term reliability, showing that connection can take many forms, not all of them romantic or conventionally expressive. The film's treatment of Mary Beth Medina has drawn significant critical ire, marking a notable regression from the first film. Instead of being a capable investigator, she is often relegated to the role of the classic spoilsport woman cliché, the voice of procedure and caution that our heroes are destined to ignore, creating a friction that feels narratively mandated rather than organic. Her character's negative reception highlights a failure in the writing. She is described in critical analyses as having little character development and being an afterthought who got in the way. Her job is to carry the badge, to issue warnings that will be ignored, and to provide a superficial government sanction for a mission that is fundamentally a personal vigilante crusade. The film's climax converges on a hidden camp in Mexico where Burke's men are holding the kidnapped children. This location shift is a classic action movie escalation, moving from the tight, controlled spaces of financial investigation into a lawless, wide-open battleground. The mission stakes become visually clear: cages, armed guards, and a ticking clock. The Juarez shootout is the film's grand action set piece, and it is designed to be both a tactical display and an emotional catharsis. Christian and Braxton systematically tear through Burke's defenses in a symphony of violence that blends Christian's calculated precision with Braxton's brutal improvisation. It is their brotherly duet, performed with automatic weapons. This large-scale action sequence has been singled out by many positive reviews as a potential best-of-the-year contender. It delivers on the visceral promise of the R rating, showcasing brawny hand-to-hand combat and high body count gunplay that is choreographed to highlight the distinct fighting styles of the two brothers, making the action itself an expression of character. The successful rescue of the children, including Anaïs's son, provides the film with its clearest moral victory. It is a happy ending for the innocent victims that serves to retroactively justify the extreme violence inflicted by the protagonists. The brothers, for all their lethal methods, are positioned unequivocally as saviors. The fact that neither Christian nor Braxton dies is a significant deviation from genre expectations, where a tragic end for at least one of them might feel narratively preordained. Their survival allows the film to end not on a note of sacrifice and sorrow, but on one of reunion and a surprisingly heartfelt and oddly sweet brotherly bonding. This ending cements the film's primary identity not as a crime thriller, but as a peculiar family drama wrapped in an action movie's skin. The central journey is not just to dismantle a trafficking ring, but for these two lonely man-children to find their way back to each other, expressing their love in the only language they both fluently speak: shared purpose and protective violence. The thematic analysis of loneliness is arguably where The Accountant 2 finds its most authentic note. Affleck, both as an actor and a public figure, has spoken about how Christian's yearning for connection resonated profoundly with him, and this personal truth bleeds into the performance, giving weight to moments of quiet failure and awkward striving. Christian's attempts at normalcy, the line dancing at a honky-tonk bar to impress a waitress, the algorithmic speed dating, are not treated as glib jokes. They are presented as genuine, heroic efforts to bridge an almost unbridgeable gap between his internal world and external relationships, making his inevitable fumbles poignant rather than purely laughable. The film's dive into the theme of immigration and human trafficking is more of a functional backdrop than a deep exploration. The Salvadoran family's plight and the mechanism of the smuggling ring serve as a moral pretext, creating a villain class that is unambiguously evil. The theme is, as one analysis noted, gestured at more than spelled out, empowering a simple good versus evil narrative. The critical reception of The Accountant 2 is a fascinating case study in divided expectations. Its IMDb score hovers around a 6.7, an aggregate that masks a deep chasm between passionate defenders and harsh detractors. There is little middle ground on this film. It is either a superior, funnier sequel or a scattershot, tonally confused misfire. Positive analyses celebrate the film's embrace of its own cartoonishness. For these critics, the film is a rambunctious big-time thriller that successfully pivots into a shaggy, silly bro hangout movie. The sheer chemistry between Affleck and Bernthal is considered a sufficient engine to pull a convoluted train of a plot across the finish line. Conversely, negative reviews, such as the scathing "this accountant doesn't add up" critique, point to a fundamental identity crisis. The argument is that the film never decides what it wants to be, lurching between comedy, brutal action, sentimental drama, and conspiracy thriller without ever finding a cohesive tone or a singular, hateable villain to tie it all together. A specific point of contention is the film's shift in tone from the original. Many fans of the 2016 film lament the loss of Christian's tightly wound, methodical characterization, feeling he has become a caricature of himself. The humor, while praised by some, is seen by others as a betrayal of the grounded, serious atmosphere that made the original distinctive. The writing, by Bill Dubuque, is repeatedly cited in negative analyses as the film's weak link. Criticisms focus on overly convoluted plotting with too many subplots that are poorly connected and exposition that is delivered flatly. The script's reliance on the harbor neuroscience children to resolve impossible situations is a particular sticking point. The genre analysis reveals a film attempting to be an action thriller, a buddy comedy, and a crime drama simultaneously. The calculated crazy dynamic pushes it firmly into buddy comedy territory, with the brothers' arguments providing a welcome, often hilarious, diversion. Yet these same comedic rhythms can undercut the tension that a thriller requires. The film's technical execution is a mixed bag. Gavin O'Connor's direction is competent and occasionally inspired in the action sequences, but he is clearly more interested in the rambunctious thrills than the dogged realism of his first outing. The action choreography, particularly the Juarez climax, is a high point, delivering on its violent promise. However, the musical score is a widely criticized technical element. It is panned for sounding like stock suspense cues pulled from a bargain bin, a generic sonic wallpaper that fails to build atmosphere or tension, actively draining scenes of any weight instead of elevating them. A distinctive score might have papered over some of the tonal cracks. The comparison to the 2016 original is unavoidable and stark. The first film was a methodical thriller where Christian's accounting was integral to the plot. The sequel minimizes the accounting to the point where there is virtually no accounting, replacing intellectual problem-solving with more conventional, John Wick-style action. It trades forensic uniqueness for bullet count familiarity. The finale provides a double-layered resolution. On the surface, Justine delivers the key evidence to Mary Beth, ensuring that Burke's criminal network is exposed through proper channels, and he is likely captured. This is the legal, system-based victory, tidying up the external plot. The deeper resolution is entirely personal. The brothers reunite, their bond reforged in the crucible of combat. This emotional victory supersedes the plot mechanics. The film argues that the real prize is not bringing down a bad guy, but the reclamation of family, however unconventional and violent that family may be. Anice's ambiguous fate adds a final, tragic dimension. She survives the carnage, a formidable adversary who is not simply vanquished. Her story, that of a mother's love horrifically perverted by trauma, doesn't end with a neat bow. She remains a ghost, a shadow of what was lost, adding a subtle sting of darkness to the otherwise triumphant ending. The film's final moments are unapologetically designed to set up a franchise. Multiple critical analyses note that the ending sneakily sets the stage for The Accountant 3, leaving a glimmer of evil to stalk another day, and positioning the newly reunited brothers as a potential on-call vigilante duo. The formula is now open-ended. This franchise setup is both a commercial calculation and a narrative promise. It suggests that a third film could finally fully deliver on the buddy action comedy potential that the sequel so heavily leans into, now that the often messy work of broadening the original's scope has been completed. The final verdict on The Accountant 2, as synthesized from these analyses, is that it is a fundamentally inessential but often amusing piece of entertainment. It does not match the original's impact or its focused, unique character study, but it compensates with a robust and wildly entertaining rapport between its two leads. The film's ultimate lesson is about managing expectations. For viewers seeking a serious exploration of neurodivergence wrapped in a tightly woven thriller, it will be a profound disappointment. For those open to a blithely nonsensical, enjoyably vulgar buddy movie where two brothers bicker and shoot their way through a ludicrous plot, it will be a surprisingly good time. It is a film where the whole is lesser than the sum of its parts, but its best part, the Affleck-Bernthal dynamic, is so strong that it single-handedly makes the experience worthwhile for many. Their chemistry is the alpha and omega of its success, a loving combat that feels real enough to make one hope their next adventure does not take another 9 years to arrive. The Accountant 2 opens with a visual language that immediately signals a departure from the cool, clinical aesthetic of its predecessor, embracing warmer tones and a more textured, lived-in cinematic texture. The tavern where Raymond King meets his fate is not a sleek financial district bar, but a working-class establishment with peeling paint, sticky floors, and the quiet desperation of people who conduct their business in shadows, immediately grounding the high-concept plot in a recognizable, tactile reality that makes the subsequent violence feel more transgressive and unsettling. J.K. Simmons, despite his brief screen time, delivers a performance that carries the accumulated weight of a character who has spent years navigating the moral gray zones between law enforcement and the darker currents of the world. His Raymond King is a man who has made peace with compromise, who understands that justice sometimes requires methods that cannot be written down in official reports. And his death is not just a plot device, but a thematic statement about the cost of living in that uncomfortable space between right and legal. The phrase "find the accountant," written in blood on a dying man's arm, functions as more than a simple clue, operating instead as a narrative talisman that transforms Christian Wolfe from a hidden, almost mythical figure into an active participant in a world that has been searching for him without knowing his name. This moment of transmission, from a dying mentor to a living protege, carries an almost ritualistic quality, passing a burden that cannot be borne by normal institutional structures and must instead be shouldered by someone who exists outside them entirely. Mary Beth Medina's trajectory from field agent to director of FinCEN represents a significant power shift that the film explores with more nuance than is immediately apparent, as her institutional authority paradoxically limits her operational freedom in ways that make her dependent on the very vigilante she once pursued. She has become the system she once chafed against, and the film subtly critiques this ascension by showing how her hands are tied by protocols, politics, and oversight in ways that Christian, operating entirely off the books, never has to consider. The speed dating sequence that reintroduces Christian Wolff is a miniature masterpiece of comedic discomfort that reveals more about his internal development than any exposition-heavy monologue could achieve, demonstrating his genuine desire for connection while simultaneously highlighting the fundamental disconnect between his analytical approach to human interaction and the spontaneous, irrational nature of romantic attraction. He has solved the puzzle of finding a compatible partner on paper, but the algorithm cannot account for the unquantifiable chemistry, the inexplicable spark, or the simple reality that people are not spreadsheets to be optimized. Christian's line dancing at a honky-tonk bar represents an extraordinary moment of vulnerability that the 2016 version of this character would have found inconceivable, as he willingly places himself in a situation of potential public humiliation, attempting to master a physical, social, and culturally specific ritual in order to connect with a waitress who represents a life of simple, uncomplicated normalcy that he can observe, analyze, and imitate but never truly inhabit. The scene is both funny and heartbreaking, a physical manifestation of his desire to belong in a world that was not designed for minds like his. The algorithmic manipulation of his own dating life raises profound questions about Christian's relationship with control, suggesting that even his attempts to surrender to the unpredictability of human connection are filtered through systems he can manage and predict. This is not cheating in the conventional sense. It is a survival mechanism, a way of engaging with a terrifyingly chaotic social landscape by first mapping it, quantifying it, and reducing it to variables he can solve, even as the results repeatedly demonstrate that love cannot be hacked. When Christian recruits Braxton, the reunion is deliberately underwritten with a tension that speaks to 8 years of silence, of unspoken resentments, of the fundamental question of whether blood ties obligate continued contact when the individuals involved operate on such radically different moral frequencies. The film does not sentimentalize their relationship with a tearful embrace. Instead, it presents their reconnection as a negotiation between two men who recognize something essential in each other, but remain uncertain whether that recognition can translate into sustainable partnership. Braxton Wolff is introduced in this sequel not as a lurking threat, but as a man attempting his own version of domestic stability, revealed through the brilliant, humanizing detail that he is about to adopt a corgi puppy, a creature of uncomplicated affection and manageable needs that represents everything his relationship with his brother is not. This detail, seemingly throwaway, speaks volumes about Braxton's own loneliness, his desire for a connection that does not require the exhausting negotiation of sibling history, shared trauma, and divergent moral codes. Jon Bernthal's physical performance as Braxton is a study in controlled volatility, his body language suggesting a man who is always a half-second away from explosive violence, even in moments of apparent calm, yet who has developed enough self-awareness to channel that energy toward protective rather than purely destructive ends when properly motivated. His combat style contrasts sharply with Christian's, prioritizing overwhelming force and psychological intimidation over surgical precision, making their partnership a tactical complement as much as an emotional one. The chemistry between Affleck and Bernthal works because both actors understand that the comedy arises from absolute sincerity, that their characters are not cracking jokes for the audience's benefit but expressing genuine, deeply felt emotions through the only vocabulary available to them, which happens to involve deadpan insults, competitive bickering, and a mutual acknowledgement of each other's fundamental strangeness. Their arguments have the rhythm of a long-married couple who have learned exactly which buttons to push and precisely how much pressure each button can withstand before real damage occurs. The investigation into the missing Salvadoran family slowly peels back layers of a criminal enterprise that is depressingly banal in its brutality, revealing a network of smugglers, corrupt officials, and opportunistic criminals who treat human lives as inventory to be managed, lost, and written off according to profit margins. This is a villainy that does not require a charismatic mastermind or a monologuing antagonist. It is a systemic, industrial evil, a machine designed to extract value from desperation, and the film's refusal to personify it in a single individual is both a narrative weakness in terms of traditional storytelling and a thematic strength in terms of realism. Anais, played with haunting intensity by Daniela Pineda, is the film's most fascinating and problematic creation. A character who embodies the central tension between the franchise's desire to explore the plasticity of the human brain and its tendency to reduce that plasticity to a superpower origin story. Her acquired savant syndrome is presented as both a curse and an enhancement, robbing her of her identity, her memories, and her gentle nature while replacing them with combat abilities that make her a match for trained killers, a transformation that the film treats with horror and admiration in equal measure. The backstory of Annice's transformation deserves careful examination, as it reveals a woman who was fleeing unspeakable violence, who survived a car crash that should have killed her, and whose brain, in a desperate act of biological adaptation, rewired itself to prioritize survival skills over everything else that made her who she was. The tragedy is not that she became dangerous. The tragedy is that she lost herself entirely, retaining only flashes of her former life that torment her with glimpses of a maternal love she can no longer fully access or express. This portrayal of acquired neurodivergence is where the film's thematic ambitions run directly into the limitations of its genre framework, as the action thriller format demands that brain differences produce visible, weaponizable outcomes rather than the far more common reality of cognitive changes that are invisible, debilitating, or simply different in ways that do not translate to screen-friendly superpowers. The film cannot resist the gravitational pull of making her a formidable physical threat, when a more grounded approach might have explored the quiet horror of a woman who can no longer recognize her own child. The Harbor Neuroscience Facility functions as the film's thematic nexus, the place where all of its ideas about neurodivergence, trauma, institutional care, and latent potential converge, and it is here that the sequel most aggressively departs from any pretense of realism in favor of a near-fantastical vision of autistic capability. The children within are not merely gifted. They are depicted as possessing abilities that outstrip the combined resources of the most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet, a narrative choice that transforms them from characters into plot devices. These children, communicating through screens and Justine's synthesized British voice, represent the film's ultimate fantasy of neurodivergence as a hidden superpower, a secret weapon that the world fails to recognize or value until it needs saving. The critique embedded in this depiction, that society overlooks and institutionalizes minds that could solve its greatest problems, is a valid and powerful one, but it is undermined by the cartoonish exaggeration of their capabilities, which makes the point feel like wish fulfillment rather than social commentary. Justine herself is a character whose quiet power deserves more attention than it typically receives, as she operates as Christian's external conscience, logistical coordinator, and emotional anchor without ever speaking a word of her own in her natural voice. The relationship between her and Christian is arguably the healthiest in the entire film, built on years of mutual respect, absolute trust, and a shared understanding that communication does not require the performance of neurotypical social rituals. The synthesized voice that Justine uses, with its crisp British accent and unflappable calm, creates an interesting disconnect between the profound emotional content of her communications and the mechanical delivery system. A gap that the film occasionally exploits for dark comedy, but more often leaves as an unremarked-upon aspect of her character that the audience is expected to accept without judgment or condescension. She is not a tragic figure. She is a fully realized person whose mode of expression is simply different. Mary Beth Medina's marginalization in the narrative is a significant flaw that speaks to a broader difficulty the franchise has with integrating its female characters into the action in meaningful ways, repeatedly positioning her as the voice of institutional constraint that the male protagonists must circumvent or ignore in order to get things done. Her authority is respected in theory but undermined in practice, and the film never gives her a moment where her bureaucratic approach proves superior to the Wolf brothers' extrajudicial methods, making her presence feel vestigial rather than essential. The Juarez shootout is the film's grand operatic centerpiece, a sustained sequence of escalating violence that begins with stealth and precision, builds through waves of increasing chaos, and culminates in a cathartic explosion of brotherly coordination that sees Christian and Braxton operating as two halves of a single devastating machine. The choreography is designed to highlight their complementary approaches, with Christian providing overwatch and calculated positioning, while Braxton moves through the space as an instrument of direct, terrifying engagement. This climactic action sequence earns its praise because it understands that violence in a sequel must feel earned, must carry the accumulated emotional weight of the journey that preceded it, and must provide not just spectacle but resolution. The children's rescue is not merely a plot point. It is the physical manifestation of the brothers' redemption, a tangible proof that their violent capabilities can be directed toward unequivocal good, that the skills forged in trauma can be repurposed for protection. The decision to allow both brothers to survive is narratively bold precisely because it violates the expectation of tragic sacrifice that has become almost obligatory in stories about violent men seeking redemption. The film argues, implicitly, that survival and ongoing connection are more challenging and more interesting than a noble death, that the real work of brotherhood begins after the gunsmoke clears and the adrenaline fades, leaving two men who must figure out how to be family in peacetime. The film's ending is oddly sweet, because it earns its sweetness through contrast, the warmth of the brothers' reunion standing in stark relief against the cold brutality of everything that preceded it, and this emotional whiplash is entirely intentional. The accountant too understands that sentimental moments land harder when they are surrounded by violence, that the promise of a shared future is more precious when the immediate past has been so thick with death. The thematic treatment of loneliness in this sequel is more sophisticated than in the original because it presents loneliness not as a condition to be cured by a single romantic relationship or social breakthrough, but as an ongoing negotiation, a constant effort that produces partial victories and frequent setbacks. Christian's speed dating failures and his successful reconnection with Braxton are not competing narratives but complementary aspects of the same truth. That human connection is messy, unpredictable, and rarely arrives in the form we expect. Ben Affleck's own public relationship with loneliness and the search for connection adds a layer of metatextual resonance to his performance that the film neither courts nor avoids, simply allowing his personal history to inform the character's emotional reality without ever winking at the audience. When Christian awkwardly attempts to flirt, fails to read social cues, or retreats into the comfort of his analytical mind, the performance carries an authenticity that transcends the sometimes ludicrous plot mechanics surrounding it. The film's treatment of accounting as a professional discipline is notably diminished from the original, a shift that has disappointed many fans who found the forensic financial investigation sequences uniquely compelling and distinct from standard action movie fare. Where the first film derived tension from spreadsheets, ledgers, and the slow unraveling of financial fraud, the sequel largely abandons this vocabulary in favor of more conventional investigative techniques, losing a significant part of what made the franchise distinctive. This shift away from accounting is emblematic of the broader tonal transformation between the two films, a move from the cerebral to the visceral, from the slow-burn revelation of hidden patterns to the immediate gratification of physical confrontation. The decision is commercially understandable, but artistically questionable, as it sands away the unique texture that separated The Accountant from dozens of other action thrillers featuring competent men with guns and troubled pasts. The critical division over the film is not, at its core, about quality so much as it is about expectations and definitions, a disagreement over what kind of film this is supposed to be and what criteria should be used to evaluate it. Those who approach it as a direct continuation of the original's methodical character study find it lacking. Those who accept it as a comic book-inflected buddy action comedy find it exceeding expectations and delivering pleasures the original never attempted. The film's humor, a major point of contention among critics, operates on a frequency that either resonates or does not, drawing its comedy from the specific, peculiar dynamic between two brothers who express affection through aggression, who find genuine delight in each other's company, but lack the vocabulary to articulate that delight except through insults, practical jokes, and the shared language of violence. This is not universal humor. It is character-specific humor that works brilliantly for those tuned to its wavelength and falls flat for those expecting the drier, darker wit of the original. The supporting cast of Harbor Neuroscience children represents a narrative shortcut that the film deploys whenever the plot has painted itself into a corner. Their capabilities so vast and so vaguely defined that they can solve any technological or investigative problem the script requires, undermining the sense of earned difficulty that makes a thriller's stakes feel real. When any obstacle can be overcome by a child savant typing rapidly on a keyboard, the obstacles cease to generate genuine tension. The film's score, widely criticized as generic and ineffective, represents a significant missed opportunity to provide sonic cohesion to a narrative that struggles with tonal consistency, as a distinctive musical identity could have smoothed the transitions between comedy, action, and drama in ways that the existing stock cues cannot. Music is the emotional glue of cinema, and this film's glue is weak, failing to bind its disparate elements into a unified experience. Gavin O'Connor's direction is workmanlike and occasionally inspired in the action sequences, but it lacks the distinct authorial voice that might have made the tonal shifts feel intentional rather than haphazard. The genre hybridity feel like a deliberate artistic choice rather than a failure of nerve. He is a competent steward of the material, but the material needed a visionary, someone who could fully commit to either the grounded approach of the original or the cartoonish energy of the sequel, rather than oscillating uneasily between them. The villain problem in The Accountant 2 is a structural weakness that becomes more apparent on reflection, as the absence of a singular, memorable antagonist deprives the brothers of a focal point for their righteous violence and the audience of a face to attach to the evil being opposed. Burke is more a concept than a character, a name attached to a network of criminals rather than a flesh-and-blood presence whose defeat provides cathartic satisfaction. This diffusion of villainy is intellectually defensible as a commentary on systemic evil, but it is dramatically unsatisfying in an action thriller format that traditionally thrives on the eventual confrontation between hero and villain. The film tries to compensate by making Anais a formidable physical opponent, but her tragic dimension prevents her from functioning as a hateable antagonist, leaving a vacuum at the center of the conflict. The brotherly relationship at the film's core is elevated by the performances and diminished by the writing, which too often settles for sitcom-level bickering when it might have explored the deeper, more uncomfortable questions of what it means to love someone whose moral compass points in a fundamentally different direction. The film gestures toward these depths without ever fully diving in, preferring the safety of banter to the risk of genuine emotional excavation. The representation of autism in The Accountant 2 exists in a complex and contested space, simultaneously groundbreaking in its commitment to an autistic action hero and regressive in its reliance on savant stereotypes that reduce neurodivergence to a collection of marketable superpowers. This tension is not easily resolved and may not be resolvable within the constraints of a mainstream action franchise, which will always privilege spectacle over nuance, ability over accommodation. Christian Wolf's characterization in this sequel shows growth in his emotional availability, while paradoxically reducing the complexity of his neurodivergent experience, smoothing away the more challenging aspects of his autism in the original. The sensory sensitivities, the stimmying, the profound social confusion, in favor of a more palatable version who is merely quirky, particular, and occasionally oblivious. This is assimilation, not representation, and it represents a loss of what made the character genuinely distinctive. The film's treatment of violence as a language of love between the brothers is perhaps its most uncomfortable and fascinating subtext, suggesting that for men shaped by trauma and trained in killing, the act of fighting alongside someone is the most profound intimacy they can access. This is a bleak but honest observation about the limitations that violence imposes on the human capacity for connection, a recognition that the tools of survival can become the only tools one has. Anaïs's ambiguous survival at the film's end leaves open the possibility of her return as a more fully developed antagonist or even a reluctant ally in a potential third installment, her acquired savant syndrome positioning her as a dark mirror to Christian, someone whose brain has been similarly altered by trauma but who lacks the support system that allows him to channel his abilities toward constructive ends. She is the cautionary tale, the road not taken. The film's engagement with immigration as a theme is superficial, but not entirely empty, as it correctly identifies the ways in which restrictive border policies create profitable black markets for smuggling, turning human desperation into a commodity and empowering the most ruthless operators within those illicit economies. This observation is not original, but it provides a credible framework for the criminal enterprise the brothers dismantle. The Accountant 2, in its final accounting, is a film of fascinating fragments that never fully cohere, a collection of strong performances, interesting ideas, and effective sequences that are individually compelling but collectively unsatisfying, held together not by a unifying vision, but by the sheer gravitational pull of its two lead actors who refuse to let the material fail around them. Their commitment is the film's salvation and its implicit critique, a demonstration of what might have been possible if every element had been brought to their level. The franchise's future, clearly telegraphed by the ending, will depend on whether a third film can synthesize the best elements of both predecessors. The grounded character study and unique professional specificity of the original and the buddy comedy chemistry and emotional warmth of the sequel, creating a hybrid that honors what came before while pushing into genuinely new territory rather than simply oscillating between two incomplete visions. The Accountant 2 ultimately serves as a reminder that sequels are interpretive acts, readings of the original text that emphasize certain elements while de-emphasizing others, and that the choices made in this process of interpretation reveal as much about the filmmaker's understanding of what made the first film work as they do about their ambitions for the franchise's future. In this case, the interpretation is clear. They believe the future lies not in spreadsheets and silence, but in brotherhood and bullets. The choice to kill Raymond King so early and so definitively carries a metatextual weight that savvy viewers will recognize as J.K. Simmons, an actor of considerable gravitas and audience affection, is dispatched not for narrative reasons alone, but to signal that this sequel operates under harsher rules than its predecessor, that no character, regardless of their importance to the original film or the esteem in which their performer is held, is safe from the consequences of the world being constructed. Daniela Pineda's Anais enters the film not as a fully formed antagonist, but as a mystery wrapped in trauma. Her first appearance presenting her as a potential victim, a distressed woman seeking help, only to gradually reveal layers of capability and danger that invert the audience's initial sympathies and force a reconsideration of every interaction she has had on screen. This slow reveal structure is one of the film's more effective narrative strategies, playing on expectations about female vulnerability in action cinema to generate genuine surprise when her true nature emerges. The acquired savant syndrome that defines Anais is rooted, however loosely, in documented neurological phenomena where traumatic brain injury has resulted in the sudden emergence of extraordinary abilities, a reality far stranger and more controversial than fiction typically dares to suggest. The film takes this grain of scientific truth and expands it into a full-blown origin story for a killing machine, a transformation that the medical community would rightly dispute, but that serves the narrative's need for an antagonist who can physically challenge the protagonists. What makes Anais tragic rather than merely monstrous is the specificity of her loss. The film taking care to establish through fragmented flashbacks and carefully placed exposition that she was not always the creature she has become, that somewhere beneath the lethal programming her brain has written over her former self, there remains a mother who crossed borders seeking safety for her child, who endured horrors that the film wisely leaves largely unseen, and whose ultimate fate is a form of living death more cruel than any bullet could deliver. The car crash that transforms Anais is presented as a kind of dark miracle, a random intersection of physics, biology, and trauma that could easily have killed her, but instead remade her into something that the world's intelligence agencies would study and weaponize if they could replicate the results. The film flirts with the implication that certain governmental or criminal entities might be doing exactly that harbor neuroscience and its population of savant children might represent only the benevolent face of a much darker research agenda. The Harbor Neuroscience Facility, when Christian and Braxton finally arrive there, is presented with a visual warmth that contrasts sharply with the cold institutional settings of the first film, suggesting that the years since Christian's departure have transformed it from a place of containment into a genuine sanctuary, a space where neurodivergent children are not merely housed but nurtured, their abilities recognized and cultivated rather than suppressed or medicated into submission. This evolution mirrors Christian's own journey toward greater emotional availability. The children of Harbor Neuroscience function collectively as a kind of Greek chorus with root access to global information networks, their commentary on the unfolding plot delivered not through lyrical speech, but through the rapid acquisition and analysis of data that would take conventional intelligence agencies weeks to compile. They are the film's most fantastical element, and also its most pointed critique of a society that warehouses and underestimates minds that could, if properly supported, transform the world. Justine's role as the intermediary between these children and the adult world of violence and conspiracy positions her as the film's true moral center, a character who has chosen to use her considerable organizational and communicative abilities not for profit or power, but for the creation and maintenance of a safe space where exceptional minds can develop without exploitation. Her British-accented computer voice, far from being a gimmick, represents a deliberate choice of presentation that commands a certain respect and authority that her natural silence might not receive from a neurotypical world. The parallel between Justine's computer-mediated communication and Christian's algorithmic approach to human interaction is one of the film's more subtle structural rhymes, both characters having developed technological interfaces to manage their engagement with a social world that does not accommodate their natural modes of expression. Where Justine has found peace with this arrangement, Christian remains restless, still seeking a direct, unmediated connection that his neurology may simply not be equipped to provide in the form he imagines. Mary Beth Medina's character arc across the two films, such as it is, traces a trajectory from active hunter to passive facilitator, a diminishment of agency that the sequel attempts to mask with a promotion in title, but cannot hide in terms of narrative function. She exists in this story primarily to receive information, to express official concern that will be ignored, and to provide the thin veneer of legal authorization over actions that are fundamentally extrajudicial, a role that requires her to be present without ever being truly consequential. This marginalization of Medina speaks to a broader limitation in Bill Dubuque's screenplay, which seems uncertain how to write a competent woman in a position of institutional authority without making her either an antagonist to the hero's methods or an ineffective figurehead whose warnings serve only to heighten the protagonist's renegade appeal. The film lacks the imagination to conceive of a female character who could be both rule-bound and effective, both institutionally loyal and operationally essential. The speed dating sequence, for all its comedic value, contains a kernel of genuine pathos in the way it depicts Christian's fundamental misunderstanding of what romantic connection actually requires, his assumption that compatibility can be reduced to a set of variables that, properly optimized, will yield a predictable result. This is the same mind that can unravel a multinational fraud conspiracy by finding the one number that does not belong, and the film suggests, with some tenderness, that the very cognitive tools that make him extraordinary are the ones that make ordinary happiness so elusive. The waitress at the honky-tonk bar represents a road not taken, a vision of life that Christian can observe and even temporarily imitate through the structured physical language of line dancing, but can never truly inhabit, not because he is incapable of love, but because the specific form of connection she represents, spontaneous, uncalculated, built on shared cultural references and easy conversation, is simply not available to a mind that processes every social interaction as a problem to be solved. Christian's instigation of the bar fight for Braxton's benefit is a moment of characterization so efficient and revealing that it deserves to be studied in screenwriting courses as an example of showing rather than telling, as it communicates in perhaps 30 seconds of screen time that Christian understands his brother's needs, accepts his brother's nature without judgment, and expresses his affection through the creation of opportunities rather than the declaration of feelings. This is love translated into tactical action, and it is the most honest expression of their bond in the entire film. Braxton's response to this gift of violence is equally revealing, a flash of genuine delight that crosses his face before he wades into the brawl, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy that contrasts with the brooding intensity that characterizes his default state. Jon Bernthal plays this transition with a lightness that transforms Braxton from a frightening presence into an almost endearing one, a man who has found his vocation and is grateful for every opportunity to practice it. The adoption of the corgi puppy is not merely a throwaway character detail, but a carefully placed counterweight to Braxton's lethal capabilities, a signal to the audience that this man, who can and does kill without apparent remorse, possesses a capacity for nurturing and attachment that finds its most uncomplicated expression in his relationship with animals. The corgi, a breed associated with benign good humor and royal companionship, serves as a perfect absurdist contrast to Braxton's violent profession. The investigation that leads the brothers toward Burke's smuggling ring is structured less as a procedural and more as a series of confrontations, each encounter stripping away another layer of the criminal enterprise while revealing the extent to which it is embedded in legitimate business, corrupt law enforcement, and the economic desperation that drives migrants into the hands of smugglers in the first place. The film gestures toward systemic critique without ever fully committing to it, preferring to personalize the evil in a series of disposable henchmen rather than explore the conditions that make such enterprises profitable. The absence of a charismatic central villain, while widely criticized, can also be read as a deliberate anti-escalation strategy, a refusal to manufacture a supervillain who would inevitably feel like a retread of the first film's antagonist or an implausible escalation thereof. By making the enemy a network rather than an individual, the film argues, however imperfectly, that the real evil is systemic, distributed, and therefore much harder to defeat with a single well-placed bullet. This systemic critique is undercut, however, by the film's ultimate reliance on precisely the kind of individualized violent solution it seems to question, as the Juarez shootout, for all its tactical sophistication, is still a fantasy of heroic violence in which two exceptional men can dismantle a criminal enterprise through the targeted application of superior firepower. The film wants to have its structural critique and its cathartic violence too, and the tension between these impulses is never fully resolved. The Juarez sequence is choreographed with a spatial clarity that many modern action films lack, each phase of the assault building logically on the one before. The geography of the camp established early and respected throughout, so that the audience always understands where the characters are in relation to each other and to their objectives. This may seem like a basic requirement, but it is violated so frequently in contemporary action cinema that its presence here deserves explicit recognition. The children's rescue is staged to maximize emotional impact without becoming mawkish. The film understanding that the sight of children being freed from cages carries its own inherent power that requires no musical swelling or tearful dialogue to register. The camera simply observes their emergence into safety, their disorientation and relief, and allows the audience to supply the emotional response, a restraint that is notable in a film otherwise given to excess. The decision to allow both brothers to survive the climactic battle is a structural choice with significant franchise implications, as it preserves the central dynamic for future installments rather than sacrificing one brother for the emotional impact of a heroic death, and then scrambling to contrive a reason for the survivor to continue operating without his counterpart. This is a commercial calculation, certainly, but it is also a narrative one that reflects the film's investment in the ongoing relationship rather than the completed arc. The oddly sweet quality of the ending arises from the contrast between the violence that preceded it and the domesticity that follows. The brothers' reunion taking place not in a hail of gunfire, but in a space of relative calm where they can simply be together. The mission accomplished, the immediate threat neutralized, and the long work of learning to be brothers in peacetime stretching out before them like an uncharted territory they will need to navigate together. This ending suggests that the true sequel to The Accountant is not the investigation or the conspiracy or the action set pieces, but the story of what happens after the violence ends, when two men who have defined themselves through conflict must discover who they are in its absence. The third film, should it materialize, would do well to take this implication seriously rather than simply contriving another conspiracy that requires their particular talents. The film's treatment of neurodivergence as a spectrum that includes both Christian's autism and Anaïs's acquired savant syndrome creates an uncomfortable equivalence that the screenplay seems not to fully recognize, suggesting that brain difference, regardless of its origin or expression, is fundamentally a kind of latent superpower waiting for the right trigger to activate. This is a fantasy, and like all fantasies, it reveals more about the desires of its creators than about the reality it purports to represent. The moments in which Christian's autism is treated not as an ability but as a genuine challenge, his difficulty reading sarcasm, his discomfort with physical touch outside of combat, his need for routine and predictability, are the moments when the character feels most real and most valuable as representation. Precisely because they do not serve the plot or enhance his capabilities, but simply depict a human being navigating a world not designed for him. These moments of genuine representation are unfortunately rarer in the sequel than in the original. The filmmakers seemingly having decided that audiences' affection for Christian is now secure enough that his more challenging traits can be sanded away in favor of a more conventionally likable protagonist who happens to have a few quirks. This is a loss, not a gain, and it diminishes the character's distinctiveness even as it may broaden his commercial appeal. The buddy comedy dynamic between Affleck and Bernthal works so well that it threatens to overwhelm everything else in the film, creating an experience where the audience is so eager to return to the brothers' bickering that every scene without them feels like an interruption, every plot development without their commentary feels like a chore. This is a good problem for the actors to have created, but a significant structural problem for the film, which has other business to attend to that cannot match the pleasure of their company. The film's self-awareness about its own ridiculousness is a double-edged sword, as the knowing humor that punctuates the action sequences signals to the audience that they need not take any of this too seriously, which in turn undermines the stakes that the plot has worked to establish. It is difficult to feel genuine concern for characters who seem to be winking at the camera, and the film never quite finds the balance between commitment to its emotional reality and ironic distance from its genre conventions. The musical score's inadequacy is most apparent in these transitional moments, where a composer with a stronger vision might have used thematic material to bridge the gap between comedy and action, between irony and sincerity, creating a sonic through-line that unified the film's disparate tones. The absence of such a score leaves the film feeling pieced together from incompatible parts rather than unified by a coherent artistic vision. The Accountant 2's place in the broader landscape of action cinema is as an interesting anomaly, a sequel that is simultaneously more and less than its predecessor, more entertaining in its moment-to-moment pleasures, but less cohesive in its overall effect, more ambitious in its thematic reach, but less disciplined in its narrative construction. It is a film that improves on the original in ways that do not ultimately matter and regresses in ways that do. The franchise's future hinges on a question that the sequel raises but cannot answer: whether the Wolf brothers can sustain audience interest across multiple installments without the specific, quirky context of forensic accounting that made the first film distinctive, or whether they will simply become another pair of action heroes, distinguished from their competitors only by a few eccentricities that will themselves become formulaic with repetition. Ben Affleck's performance across both films represents one of the more underappreciated achievements in contemporary action cinema, a sustained character study conducted within the constraints of a genre that does not typically reward subtlety or reward patience. His Christian Wolf is a creation of genuine complexity, and even when the sequel's writing lets him down, his commitment to the role does not waver. Jon Bernthal's Braxton is the discovery of the franchise, a character who could easily have been a one-note psychopath, but instead emerges as something far more interesting. A man who has made an uneasy peace with his own nature, who knows what he is and has stopped apologizing for it, and whose capacity for violence coexists with a genuine, almost childlike capacity for loyalty and affection. This is not an easy balance to strike, and Bernthal strikes it with apparent effortlessness. The relationship between the brothers, as rendered by these two actors, transcends the limitations of the script that contains it, suggesting depths of shared history and complicated love that the dialogue only occasionally touches, but that the performances make consistently felt. This is the alchemy of great casting, and it is the primary reason to hope that the franchise continues, because the chemistry between these two men deserves more room to develop than even a 2-hour-plus sequel can provide. The Accountant 2, in its final analysis, is a film that succeeds in spite of itself, carried to respectability by performances that outclass the material, sequences that deliver visceral satisfaction independent of narrative coherence, and a central relationship that generates more genuine emotion than the plot that surrounds it earns. It is a deeply flawed film, but its flaws are interesting, and its successes are memorable, and that combination, in an era of focus group predictability, is worth more than a dozen perfectly competent but utterly forgettable action movies. Whether there is an Accountant 3 remains to be seen, but the sequel has done the essential work of a middle chapter. It has preserved and deepened the characters we care about. It has opened up narrative possibilities that the first film could not have anticipated, and it has left us wanting more even as we recognize that what we have just watched is not everything it could have been. This is the paradoxical achievement of The Accountant 2, a film that is less than the sum of its ambitions, but more than the sum of its execution, held together by the sheer gravitational force of two brothers who have finally found each other and are not about to let go. The film's visual grammar establishes a deliberate contrast between the sterile, geometric environments where Christian's accounting work traditionally unfolds and the organic, chaotic spaces where Braxton operates most comfortably. A visual dichotomy that externalizes their internal differences and prepares the audience for the inevitable collision and synthesis of these two worlds when the brothers finally join forces against a threat that spans both domains. This spatial coding is so consistent that attentive viewers can predict the nature of an upcoming scene simply by noting the architecture and lighting of the location before any dialogue is spoken, a testament to the production design team's thoughtful integration of character and environment that elevates the film beyond standard action thriller aesthetics. The color palette of the sequel represents a significant evolution from the original's cool blues and grays, incorporating warmer amber tones, dusty Mexican landscapes, and the neon-inflected interiors of the honky-tonk bar where Christian attempts his line-dancing courtship ritual, suggesting a world that has become more emotionally available and sensorily rich as Christian himself has opened up to experience beyond the monochromatic discipline of his professional life. This chromatic shift is not merely decorative, but functions as an unspoken commentary on the character's internal state, the external world blooming into color as his emotional range expands. The sound design deserves particular attention for its treatment of Christian's auditory experience. The mix occasionally shifting to simulate his heightened sensitivity to certain frequencies while muffling others, creating a subjective soundscape that briefly immerses the audience in his perceptual reality before pulling back to conventional presentation. These moments of auditory subjectivity are deployed sparingly but effectively, reminding viewers that Christians' relationship with the physical world is fundamentally different from their own without turning that difference into a constant gimmick that would exhaust rather than enlighten. The film's approach to violence as communication reaches its most explicit articulation in a scene where Christian, unable to find words to express his concern for Braxton's safety, instead cleans and checks his brother's weapons with methodical precision, an act of care that Braxton immediately understands and acknowledges with a barely perceptible nod. This is the film's thesis statement on brotherly love made physical, the argument that for men raised in violence and trained to suppress vulnerability, the maintenance of killing tools is as intimate as a hug and as eloquent as a declaration of devotion. The geopolitical implications of the smuggling operation are acknowledged with more sophistication than critics have generally credited. The film understanding that the pipeline moving human cargo from Central America through Mexico into the United States is not simply a criminal enterprise, but a market response to immigration policies that create scarcity of legal pathways, generating enormous profits for those willing to exploit the gap between desperate demand and restricted supply. The film does not belabor this point, but it does not ignore it either, allowing the structural critique to exist as subtext rather than speechifying. The specific choice of a Salvadoran family as the narrative's emotional anchor carries historical weight that the film trusts its audience to recognize. El Salvador's decades of civil war, gang violence, and economic collapse having created one of the most persistent migration crises in the Western Hemisphere. A context that makes the family's desperation legible without requiring extensive exposition that would slow the narrative momentum. This is efficient storytelling that respects the audience's intelligence and prior knowledge. The character of Anais functions as a dark mirror to Christian in ways that extend beyond their shared experience of brain alteration, both having been shaped by institutions that recognized their potential and sought to direct it toward specific ends, both struggling with the gap between their capabilities and their capacity for human connection, and both ultimately defined by their relationship to violence as a primary mode of engaging with the world. The crucial difference, the film suggests, is that Christian has found people who love him for who he is rather than for what he can do, and this support system makes all the difference between becoming a protector and becoming a weapon. The Harbor Neuroscience children's capabilities, however exaggerated for cinematic effect, gesture toward a genuine and underappreciated reality. That neurodivergent minds often excel in pattern recognition, systematic thinking, and sustained focus on complex problems that neurotypical minds find exhausting or overwhelming. Abilities that are genuinely valuable in fields like cybersecurity and data analysis, but that go unrecognized when the individuals possessing them are judged only by their deficits rather than their strengths. The film's fantasy is not that these abilities exist, but that they could be so seamlessly and completely weaponized without the accompanying challenges that real neurodivergent individuals navigate daily. The screenplay's treatment of Justine's nonverbal communication represents a quiet revolution in representation that has gone largely unremarked in critical discourse. Presenting a character who does not speak not as pitiable or inspirational, but as fully competent, possessed of agency and authority, her computer-generated voice treated by everyone who interacts with her as simply her voice, requiring no special acknowledgement or accommodation beyond the basic respect of listening when she speaks. This normalization of communication difference is, in its way, more radical than the flashier representation of Christian's savant abilities. The technological infrastructure that Justine commands, the network of screens and secure connections and encrypted databases through which she and the Harbor children access the world's information, is presented not as a sterile command center, but as a warm, almost domestic space, filled with personal touches and the visual evidence of children's presence, suggesting that this work is not a cold exercise in data manipulation, but a community endeavor undertaken by real people in a real place, that happens to be virtual in its reach but physical in its heart. The production design of this space communicates care in every detail. The speed dating sequence's deeper function within the narrative structure is to establish Christian's emotional vulnerability before the plot demands that he access violence, creating an audience investment in his humanity that pays dividends during the action sequences when that humanity is necessarily suppressed in favor of tactical efficiency. We remember the man who awkwardly tried to flirt, who analyzed compatibility metrics, who genuinely wanted to connect. And this memory makes the killer he becomes not less impressive, but more tragic, a reminder of the cost of the skills he has developed. The algorithmic manipulation of Christians' dating prospects raises ethical questions that the film acknowledges without resolving. Questions about consent, about the authenticity of connections formed on manipulated foundations, and about whether someone whose mind works as Christians can ever engage in the spontaneous, uncalculated dance of courtship that neurotypical people take for granted. The film does not answer these questions because they may not have answers, but it deserves credit for asking them, however implicitly. The line dancing sequence is choreographed with mathematical precision that mirrors Christians' cognitive approach to the task, each step learned as a discrete variable, the sequence memorized as an algorithm, the execution flawless, but somehow missing the ineffable quality of musicality that transforms a series of movements into dance. This is the tragedy of Christian's neurology made visible. He can do everything right and still miss the point, because the point is not technical perfection but emotional expression, and emotional expression cannot be reverse-engineered from first principles. The waitress who inspires this attempt at normalcy is herself an interesting figure of narrative economy, a character who appears only briefly, but who represents an entire world of uncomplicated social interaction, regular employment, and community belonging that Christian can observe and appreciate, but never enter. Not because she would reject him, but because the gap between their modes of being is too vast for either of them to bridge without a guide they do not possess. She is not a love interest. She is a symbol of a life that is not available to him, and the film's restraint in not forcing a romantic subplot with her is commendable. The bar fight that Christian instigates for Braxton's entertainment is a scene that could easily have been merely comic relief, but that the film treats with surprising gravity. The violence that erupts serving as a reminder that beneath the buddy comedy banter, both brothers are genuinely dangerous men whose idea of fun involves the infliction of pain on others. The scene walks a careful line between celebrating their competence and acknowledging the darkness of their appetites, never fully resolving into either comedy or horror, but existing in the uncomfortable space between. Braxton's delight in the violence Christian provides is the most unguarded emotion he displays in the entire film, and Bernthal plays this moment with a childlike glee that is simultaneously endearing and disturbing. A reminder that Braxton is not a hero in any conventional sense, but a man whose moral development was arrested by trauma and who has built a functioning life around his most antisocial impulses. The film does not judge him for this, but neither does it pretend that his joy in violence is anything other than what it is. The corgi puppy that Braxton plans to adopt functions as a narrative promise that the film makes to the audience, a guarantee that this character, however lethal, however morally compromised, will survive to provide a home for a creature that depends on him. And this promise allows the audience to invest in his journey without the anxiety that he will be sacrificed for a cheap emotional beat. The corgi is Braxton's insurance policy, and the audience understands this intuitively even if the character does not articulate it. The investigation's procedural elements, while diminished from the first film, still contain moments of genuine forensic intelligence that remind viewers of what made the original distinctive, particularly a scene where Christian identifies a money laundering operation by noticing that the numerical patterns in a seemingly legitimate business's accounts follow a distribution curve that occurs in nature, but never in honest bookkeeping. This is the forensic accountant's equivalent of a detective noticing that a witness's story is too neat, and it is the kind of detail that the franchise should lean into rather than away from. The criminal network's financial structure, when Christian finally unravels it, reveals a sophistication that belies the brutishness of its foot soldiers, suggesting that the real villains of the piece are not the men with guns but the accountants, lawyers, and financial intermediaries who transform the proceeds of human misery into clean, untraceable assets that can be invested in legitimate enterprises. This is a truth about organized crime that action cinema rarely acknowledges, and its presence here, however briefly, honors the franchise's origins in the unglamorous world of financial investigation. The absence of a central villain, which has been a point of criticism, can also be understood as a deliberate structural choice that prevents the audience from experiencing the false catharsis of a single death solving a systemic problem, forcing the recognition that the network will survive even if Burke is captured. that other smugglers will fill the vacuum, that the conditions creating demand for smuggling services remain unchanged by anything the Wolf brothers can accomplish with bullets. This is a darker and more honest ending than the traditional villain's death would provide, and the film's commitment to it, however awkwardly executed, deserves acknowledgement. The Juarez Shootout's choreography incorporates a tactical vocabulary that rewards attentive viewing, with Christian and Braxton using hand signals, positioning, and coordinated fields of fire that demonstrate their professional competence and their intuitive understanding of each other's movements, a visual argument that their brotherhood, however complicated, has made them a more effective fighting unit than either could be alone. The action is not merely spectacle, it is characterization by other means. The rescue of the children is staged to avoid the sentimental pitfalls that often accompany such sequences in action cinema. The children themselves treated not as props to be saved, but as individuals with agency who have survived a horrific experience through their own resilience. Their rescue an act of liberation rather than salvation. The Wolf brothers do not save them. They open the cages, and the children walk out under their own power, a distinction that matters. The emotional reunion between the rescued children and their families, occurring largely off-screen and without dialogue, is the film's most mature narrative decision, an acknowledgement that some experiences are too profound for cinematic representation, that the privacy of that reunion belongs to the characters rather than the audience, and that the film's job is not to exploit that emotion but to honor it by looking away. This restraint is remarkable in a film otherwise given to excess. The survival of both Wolf brothers opens narrative possibilities for the franchise that a more conventional film would have foreclosed, establishing a status quo in which two very different approaches to violence can coexist, conflict, and complement each other across multiple future installments. Each film potentially exploring a different aspect of their relationship as it evolves from tentative reconnection to genuine partnership to whatever comes next. The franchise is now positioned as a buddy series rather than a solo vehicle, a transformation that the sequel has accomplished with surprising smoothness. The potential for Anaïs's return in a future installment is seeded with care, her ambiguous fate leaving open the possibility that she could function as antagonist, reluctant ally, or tragic figure whose arc concludes in either redemption or destruction. The specific outcome less important than the narrative richness her character brings to a franchise that benefits from morally complex figures who cannot be easily categorized. She is the wild card that a third film could play to great effect. The thematic treatment of redemption in The Accountant 2 is more nuanced than in its predecessor, recognizing that redemption is not a single moment of heroic sacrifice, but an ongoing process of choosing, day by day and action by action, to direct one's capabilities toward protective rather than predatory ends. Both brothers are engaged in this process, and neither has completed it, and the film's refusal to grant them easy absolution is one of its most admirable qualities. The question of whether violence can ever be truly redemptive hovers over the entire film without ever being directly addressed, the narrative providing evidence for both sides of the argument without committing to a definitive answer. The brothers save children, which is undeniably good, but they do so by killing dozens of people, which is undeniably violent, and the film leaves the moral calculus to the audience rather than resolving it through narrative convenience. The film's treatment of institutional failure is a quiet through-line that connects the Treasury Department's inability to protect King, the immigration system's inability to process asylum seekers, the mental health system's inability to support neurodivergent individuals, and the criminal justice system's inability to dismantle smuggling networks. A comprehensive indictment of institutional inadequacy that makes the Wolf brothers' extrajudicial methods seem not merely exciting, but necessary. The only functional response to a world in which official systems have failed. This institutional critique, while effective as motivation for the protagonist's actions, raises uncomfortable questions that the film does not fully explore. Questions about what happens when the individuals who step into the breach left by institutional failure are themselves unaccountable to any authority, their actions constrained only by their own moral codes, which may be idiosyncratic at best and non-existent at worst. The film celebrates the Wolf brothers' effectiveness while downplaying the troubling implications of their lack of oversight. The representation of neurodivergence in The Accountant 2 exists within a broader cultural conversation about diversity in action cinema that has evolved significantly since the original film's release in 2016, and the sequel's approach, however imperfect, reflects a genuine attempt to engage with that conversation rather than simply replicating the formulas that made the first film successful. The inclusion of multiple neurodivergent characters with different presentations, capabilities, and challenges represents a step toward recognizing that autism is a spectrum rather than a single character type. The film's comedic register, which has divided audiences, represents a deliberate tonal shift that the filmmakers clearly believed was necessary to sustain audience interest across a sequel that arrives nearly a decade after the original. The humor functioning as a solvent that breaks down the accumulated solemnity of the first film's approach and allows the franchise to reinvent itself as something more sustainable across multiple installments. Whether this was the right choice is debatable, but it was clearly a choice, not an accident. The buddy comedy elements of the film draw on a rich cinematic tradition stretching back through Lethal Weapon, Midnight Run, and 48 Hours, a tradition in which two incompatible men are forced together by circumstance and discover, through conflict and mutual irritation, that they complement each other in ways neither could have anticipated. The Accountant 2 adds to this tradition the specific twist that the two men are brothers, their incompatibility rooted in shared trauma and divergent survival strategies rather than the racial, cultural, or professional differences that typically animate the genre. The film's relationship to its predecessor is best understood not as a continuation but as a reinvention, a sequel that honors the original by departing from it, recognizing that the conditions that made the first film distinctive, its novelty, its mystery, its slow revelation of Christian's nature, cannot be replicated, and that attempting to do so would yield only a diminished copy. The sequel therefore chooses to be different rather than inferior, a decision that has produced division but prevented stagnation. The Accountant 2 ultimately stands as a testament to the difficulty of sequel making in an era when audiences expect both faithful continuity and creative evolution. A contradiction that no film can fully resolve, but that this film navigates with more honesty than many, its flaws visible on the surface where they can be debated rather than hidden beneath a slick veneer of commercial calculation. It is a film that takes risks, and while not all of those risks pay off, the willingness to take them is itself worthy of respect in a franchise landscape increasingly characterized by caution and repetition. The closing image of the brothers, having survived their ordeal and secured a fragile peace, looking toward an uncertain future together, is the film's final argument that family, however damaged, however strange, however defined by violence and silence and years of distance, is still family, and that the work of maintaining it is the only work that ultimately matters. This is sentimental, certainly, but it is sentiment earned through 2 hours of watching these men struggle toward each other through obstacles both external and internal. And the film has the good sense to end on this note of hard-won hope, rather than teasing another conspiracy or setting up another mission. The Accountant 2, in the final accounting that its title punningly invites, is a film whose assets outweigh its liabilities, carried by performances that transcend the material, sequences that deliver the visceral satisfactions the genre promises, and a central relationship that generates more genuine feeling than the plot that surrounds it. It is not the film that fans of the original might have wanted, but it is the film that the franchise needed to become if it was to have a future, and that future now seems, against the odds, worth anticipating. The tavern setting functions as a liminal space where the official world King represents and the criminal underworld he investigates briefly overlap, a neutral ground where information can be exchanged and fates can be sealed without the oversight that governs formal interactions. The dim lighting and anonymous clientele providing cover for transactions that cannot occur in the fluorescent glare of government offices or the surveilled environments of modern law enforcement. This is a space from a previous century, and its anachronistic quality underscores King's status as a relic of an earlier era of investigation. The hitman's arrival disrupts not merely the meeting but the film's narrative expectations, his presence signaling that the rules governing this world have changed since the first film, that the careful cat-and-mouse games of financial investigation have given way to direct, brutal elimination, and that the institutions tasked with protecting their own are either compromised or incapable. The speed with which violence erupts establishes a new tempo for the franchise, one in which contemplation and calculation must coexist with the constant threat of sudden, decisive action. King's final act of writing on his own arm represents a triumph of will over biology, his dying brain redirecting its last resources not toward survival, but toward communication. the message scrawled in his own blood serving as both a practical clue and a symbolic transmission of responsibility from one generation of justice seekers to the next. The choice of the accountant rather than Christian's name suggests that King understood the power of archetype over individual, that Mary Beth needed not a person but a concept, a figure of almost mythical capability. Mary Beth Medina's discovery of King's body and his message initiates her character's central conflict for the film. The tension between her institutional position and the extra-institutional methods that King's message demands, a conflict that the screenplay unfortunately resolves by simply having her ignore her institutional constraints whenever the plot requires movement, rather than exploring the genuine moral complexity of a law enforcement official who must decide when the law is insufficient. This is a missed opportunity that a more patient script might have mined for significant dramatic tension. Christian Wolf's reintroduction through the speed dating sequence serves multiple narrative functions simultaneously, establishing his ongoing struggle for connection, demonstrating his continued reliance on algorithmic solutions to human problems, providing comedy that eases the audience back into his peculiar worldview, and crucially, showing that the years between films have not been static for him, that he has been actively, if unsuccessfully, working on the very human needs that the first film revealed. This is efficient screenwriting that accomplishes exposition through action rather than dialogue. The specific details of Christian's speed dating failures are carefully calibrated to be funny without being cruel, the humor arising not from mockery of his social difficulties, but from the gap between his analytical preparation and the chaotic reality of human interaction, a gap that the audience recognizes and sympathizes with even as they laugh. His algorithm may have identified compatible partners, but no algorithm can script the unpredictable flow of conversation, the subtle cues of attraction, or the inexplicable chemistry that sometimes arises between people who make no sense on paper. The film's treatment of Christian's romantic aspirations avoids the common pitfall of suggesting that finding a partner would cure his neurodivergence or complete him as a person, instead presenting his desire for love as one aspect of a full life that also includes professional satisfaction, family connection, and personal growth, none of which is positioned as more important or more redemptive than the others. This is a mature understanding of human fulfillment that action cinema rarely achieves, occupied as it usually is with the simpler equation of romantic resolution as narrative resolution. The line dancing sequence deserves extended analysis as the film's most unexpected and revealing character moment, a scene in which Christian voluntarily enters a social space entirely foreign to his experience, attempts to master a physical skill that requires both technical precision and emotional expression, and does so not for tactical advantage but for the simple, human reason of wanting to connect with another person who has shown him kindness. The vulnerability required for this attempt is immense, and Affleck plays it without irony or self-protection. The choreography of the line dance itself is a metaphor for social interaction as Christian experiences it, a sequence of prescribed steps that can be learned and replicated, but whose underlying spirit, the collective joy and spontaneous variation that experienced dancers bring to the form, remains inaccessible to him. He performs the steps correctly, but he is dancing alone in a crowd, and the waitress, whatever her feelings about him, recognizes the effort without being moved by the result. The bar fight that follows the line dancing, deliberately instigated by Christian for Braxton's entertainment, operates as a palate cleanser that restores the audience's comfortable understanding of Christian as a capable action hero after the discomfort of watching him fail at something as supposedly simple as dancing. The scene reassures us that while Christian may struggle in social situations, he is supremely competent in the domain that the genre values most, a reassurance that the film both provides and subtly critiques by making the fight a gift to his brother rather than a necessity of the plot. Braxton's introduction in this sequel is handled with a lightness that the first film, with its climactic revelation of his existence, could not afford, the audience now familiar with his identity and therefore able to appreciate the nuances of his characterization rather than simply processing the shock of his relationship to Christian. Bernthal uses this established familiarity to build a performance of greater range, allowing Braxton's humor, vulnerability, and unexpected tenderness to emerge alongside his capacity for violence. The decision to make Braxton a prospective dog owner is a stroke of characterization genius that works on multiple levels, humanizing a character who could easily become a one-dimensional tough guy, providing comic contrast between his lethal profession and his domestic aspirations, and creating a stakes-free emotional investment for the audience that functions as a promise of his survival, since the film would not introduce a corgi only to orphan it. This is character writing of the highest order, achieving in a few brief scenes what pages of dialogue could not. The corgi itself, as a breed choice, carries specific semiotic weight, its association with British royalty and benign good humor, creating a comic juxtaposition with Braxton's brutal profession that the film exploits without overplaying. The absurdity of this killing machine doting on a short-legged, perpetually smiling dog speaking volumes about the complexity of human character that simplistic moral categories cannot capture. The film understands that people contain multitudes, and that a man who kills without hesitation might also be a man who carefully measures his puppy's food. The investigation into the missing Salvadoran family unfolds through a series of revelations that gradually expand the scope of the conspiracy from a single disappearance to a transnational criminal enterprise, each new piece of information widening the circle of complicity and increasing the number of people who would prefer that the Wolf brothers stop asking questions. This is classic thriller structure executed with competence if not innovation. The familiar beats of investigation, obstruction, and violent pushback providing a reliable framework for the more original character work occurring within it. The Salvadoran family at the center of the investigation is given enough specificity to matter without consuming screen time that the film prefers to devote to its stars, their plight established through efficient exposition and a few well-chosen details that humanize them sufficiently for the audience to invest in their rescue without slowing the narrative momentum with extended scenes of their suffering. This is a calculation that some viewers will find respectful and others will find exploitative, the line between economy and erasure being particularly fine when depicting marginalized victims. The criminal network structure, as Christian uncovers it, reveals a depressing familiarity with the mechanisms of human trafficking, the smugglers operating not as a single organization, but as a loose confederation of independent operators connected by shared infrastructure, corrupt officials, and the financial systems that launder their proceeds into legitimate investments. A structure that is both more realistic and more difficult to dismantle than the centralized criminal empires of less sophisticated action films. Burke, as the closest thing the film offers to a central antagonist, remains a deliberately underwritten figure, his evil established through the consequences of his actions rather than any charismatic villainy, his face barely registered before the climax, his dialogue limited to functional commands and threats, his defeat a matter of procedural necessity rather than cathartic confrontation. This is a bold choice that prioritizes systemic critique over dramatic satisfaction, and whether it works depends entirely on the viewer's appetite for a villain who is more concept than character. Anaïs's backstory, when it is finally revealed in full, recontextualizes everything the audience has seen her do, transforming her from a mysterious antagonist into a tragic figure whose agency has been compromised by forces beyond her control. Her violence not an expression of evil, but a symptom of damage. Her pursuit of the Wolf brothers not malice, but the desperate, programmed behavior of a woman whose brain has been rewritten by trauma. The film invites compassion for her even as it requires her defeat, a complexity that enriches the moral texture of the narrative. The acquired savant syndrome that defines Anaïs is presented with enough pseudoscientific detail to feel plausible within the film's reality, while remaining sufficiently vague to resist scrutiny. The exact mechanism of her transformation left unexplained, the film trusting the audience to accept the premise without demanding neurological precision. This is genre storytelling's contract with its audience. Belief in exchange for engagement, plausibility rather than accuracy, the appearance of scientific grounding rather than its substance. The Harbor Neuroscience Facility represents the film's most explicit engagement with questions of institutional care for neurodivergent individuals, presenting a model that is clearly idealized but not entirely fantastical, a place where differences are accommodated rather than pathologized, where abilities are cultivated rather than suppressed, and where the measure of success is not normalization but flourishing. This vision, however utopian, serves as a critique of real-world institutions that prioritize conformity over development and control over growth. The children of Harbor Neuroscience, for all their exaggerated capabilities, embody a truth that the film clearly believes, that minds labeled as deficient often possess extraordinary capacities that go unrecognized because the systems designed to evaluate them are calibrated only for neurotypical expressions of intelligence. The fantasy is not that such capacities exist, but that they could be so perfectly coordinated and deployed. A fantasy that serves the narrative while pointing toward a reality that is messier but no less remarkable. Justine's role as the coordinator of these children positions her as the film's most quietly revolutionary figure. A nonverbal woman who commands a network of exceptional minds, who communicates through technology without apology or explanation, and whose authority is accepted without question by everyone who interacts with her, including the hyper-competent Christian Wolf. She is the character who most fully embodies the film's argument that different modes of being are not deficits to be overcome, but variations to be accommodated. The technological infrastructure of Justine's operation, the screens and servers and secure connections through which she and the children access global information networks, is presented not as cold machinery, but as an extension of her will, a technological nervous system that allows her to act in the world without speaking, to gather intelligence without leaving her space, to protect Christian without being physically present. This is a vision of technology as accessibility, as liberation, rather than as dehumanization or control. The relationship between Christian and Justine, conducted primarily through text and synthesized speech, is arguably the healthiest relationship in the film, characterized by mutual respect, absolute trust, and a complete absence of the friction that marks Christian's interactions with neurotypical characters who do not understand his communication style. With Justine, there is no need for translation, no performance of normalcy, just the efficient exchange of information and the quiet constancy of people who have accepted each other completely. Mary Beth Medina's character continues to suffer from the franchise's uncertainty about what to do with her. Her function in the narrative essential, but her execution underwhelming. The writing never giving her a moment that demonstrates why she rose to director of FinCEN or what unique perspective she brings to the investigation beyond official sanction. Cynthia Addai Robinson does what she can with the material, but the material does not meet her halfway, leaving a character who is present throughout the film without ever becoming present in a way that matters. The criticism of Medina as a spoilsport woman cliché is harsh but not entirely unfair. The character repeatedly placed in the position of objecting to the protagonist's methods only to be overruled or ignored. Her objections serving to highlight the hero's renegade appeal rather than to introduce genuine moral complexity or alternative approaches that might have proven equally effective. This is a writing failure, not a performance failure, and it represents the film's most significant missed opportunity for gender-balanced storytelling. The Juarez sequence's spatial clarity, praised earlier, is complemented by a temporal clarity that is equally important, the audience always understanding how much time remains before reinforcements arrive, before the children are moved, before the window of opportunity closes. A ticking clock structure that generates tension without the manipulative artificiality of a literal countdown. This is action filmmaking craft of a high order, the mechanics of suspense so smoothly integrated that they are invisible to the casual viewer. The tactical coordination between Christian and Braxton during the Juarez assault reaches its peak in a sequence where Christian, providing overwatch from an elevated position, directs Braxton's movements through the compound using hand signals and prearranged codes that the audience does not need to understand to appreciate. The brothers' communication so seamless that they function as a single distributed consciousness, each aware of the other's position, capabilities, and intentions without needing to articulate them. This is the action cinema equivalent of a duet, and it is beautiful to watch. The rescue of the children avoids the sentimental trap of having them express gratitude to their rescuers. The film understanding that children extracted from trauma do not owe their savior's emotional performance, that their silence, their shock, their slow emergence from the cages is more truthful than any tearful thank you could be, and that the brothers' motivation requires no external validation to be meaningful. The children's freedom is its own reward, and the film trusts the audience to understand this without being told. Anice's son, among the rescued children, provides the emotional bridge between the antagonist and the protagonist's mission, his presence in the camp confirming that Anice's violence, however misdirected, was motivated by something real and worth fighting for, a maternal love twisted by trauma into something unrecognizable, but still, at its core, love. The film does not reunite them on screen, leaving that reunion to the audience's imagination, a restraint that respects the privacy of that moment and the dignity of the characters. The survival of both brothers, discussed in previous analyses, carries additional significance in the context of action cinema's historical tendency to punish violent men with death. The tradition stretching from classic westerns through noir to modern action films in which the hero's violent capabilities, however necessary to the plot, must ultimately be expiated through sacrifice. The Accountant 2 rejects this tradition, arguing implicitly that survival and ongoing relationship are more interesting narrative territory than noble death and the grieving survivor. The ending's oddly sweet quality derives not just from the brothers' reunion, but from the specific texture of their interaction, which retains the awkwardness, the teasing, the inability to directly express affection that has characterized their relationship throughout, demonstrating that survival has not magically transformed them into emotionally articulate men, that they remain themselves with all their limitations, and that their love for each other exists precisely within and through those limitations rather than despite them. The potential third film is seeded not through a post-credits scene or an explicit sequel hook, but through the quiet establishment of a new status quo in which the Wolf brothers, having successfully collaborated on a mission of unambiguous moral good, might choose to continue collaborating, their partnership no longer a one-time necessity, but an ongoing possibility. This is sequel setup as organic character development rather than commercial calculation, a distinction that matters even if the ultimate result is the same. The franchise's evolution from solo vehicle to buddy series represents a significant strategic shift that the sequel navigates with more grace than might have been expected. The transition accomplished through the gradual rebuilding of the brothers' relationship rather than an abrupt pivot, the buddy dynamic earned through 2 hours of shared screen time rather than simply declared in the opening reel. This patience suggests a creative team thinking in terms of character arcs rather than franchise mechanics. The film's engagement with questions of neurodiversity and representation, however imperfect, takes place within a media landscape that has evolved significantly since 2016, with autistic characters appearing more frequently and in more varied roles than when the original Accountant was released. A context that both raises the bar for what constitutes good representation and provides more examples of what is possible when neurodivergent characters are written with nuance and respect. The sequel's uneven performance on this metric reflects the difficulty of satisfying a discourse that has become more sophisticated and more demanding. The buddy comedy elements that have divided audiences represent a genuine artistic risk, a bet that the chemistry between Affleck and Bernthal could sustain a tonal shift that would alienate some portion of the original film's audience in exchange for attracting a broader one. A calculation that makes commercial sense even if it results in a film that is less distinctive than its predecessor. Whether the bet pays off will be determined by box office returns and the discourse surrounding a potential third installment. But the willingness to take the risk is itself noteworthy in a franchise landscape characterized by creative conservatism. The Accountant 2, in its totality, is a film that rewards engagement while resisting easy categorization, its pleasures dependent on the viewer's willingness to accept its tonal shifts, to invest in its central relationship, and to forgive its narrative shortcuts in exchange for its character work. It is not a masterpiece, but it is not trying to be one, content to be an entertaining, occasionally thoughtful, occasionally frustrating action film that leaves its characters in a more interesting place than it found them, which is more than many sequels accomplish.